Welcome to Chautauqua people. My name is John V. My guest today is Bishop Gene Robinson, Vice President and Senior Pastor of Chautauqua Institution. Gene is a Kentucky native where he grew up in the Disciples Church. His father was a sharecropper where the family had no running water until he was 10 years old. He graduated from college at Sewanee, subsequently attended divinity school at the Episcopal General Theological Seminary in New York City. He joined the Diocese of New Hampshire and served there for 17 years until his election as bishop in 2013 and consecration as presiding bishop in 2003 and 2004. His selection as the country's first gay bishop in 2003 produced an enormous reaction. Gene served as bishop for a decade before joining the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. as a senior fellow. He has been a member of the staff of Chautauqua Institution since the fall of 2017. Gene, welcome to Chautauqua people.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Gene, how did you find your way to Chautauqua?
So I was invited to speak at Chautauqua, I think 3 times in the 2 o'clock religion lecture in the afternoon. And then I was invited to be the preacher for 1 week, both for the Sunday service and the 5 brief services that begin each morning there during the week.
You get no tough questions from the Sunday service, do you?
No.
Like you do in the afternoon.
Exactly. Yeah, boy, if you speak in the afternoon, you have to be ready. The folks who attend are a pretty knowledgeable bunch, and they're apt to ask very challenging questions.
But isn't that a good part of being here?
It's the best part of being here. Absolutely.
So Gene, when you came to the institution in this current role, what was your first, you've spoken about the tough questions, what were some of your first impressions when you really got to be an insider?
You know, the biggest surprise was how much was going on at Chautauqua that as a speaker I was completely unaware of. I knew there was, you know, a bit of a focus on reading and books and the oldest book club in America and all of that. I had no idea the depth and breadth of the literary arts program. I didn't really understand basically the summer camp for children, which is, you know, an operation in and of itself. And so I was surprised at how much I missed just by being there and focused on the 10:45 lecture in the morning and then the religion lectures in the afternoon.
And like with the summer program, you're a parent of 2, and so we would have expected that might have just caught up on your way of doing business.
That's exactly right. The other thing that I have to say I've really appreciated, I don't know that I've ever worked with a staff so competent and so good at what they do and so committed to our goal of, you know, in this time when there's very little dialogue going on in America because we are so polarized, we are committed to trying to turn that around so that we can hear all viewpoints of a particular question and argue, but good-heartedly so. And I think we need that right now because both sides write off the other.
I couldn't agree with you wholeheartedly. That sort of discourse is one of these things that seems to have passed from our American cultural scene, and it is absolutely regrettable. I know I'm preaching to the choir on this one.
Right, exactly.
That point. Now, I wonder if you could tell me a little more about your ministry prior to coming to Chautauqua. What sorts of things struck you, maybe that have an application to Chautauqua or that are just so profound in themselves they're worth mentioning?
Sure. I did spend most of my ministry, as you mentioned, in New Hampshire. So it's a little bit framed by the sort of New England way of doing things, which is pretty non-religious, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, New England is the least religious part of the country. But even when people have left religion, including young people, they still have religious questions. You know, who am I? Where am I going? What am I supposed to What am I supposed to be here for? Those are religious questions. And we get a lot of people saying that they are spiritual but not religious. And I think young people especially, but I think all of us are less trustful of institutions today. I would say it began with Watergate. That was a moment for me when I realized, you know what? The government isn't always doing what it says it's doing, and it isn't always working in my interest, and it doesn't always tell the truth when confronted about it. And I think as that has happened, it doesn't belong to one party or the other. It's where we've been over the last 40 years. I think people have learned to distrust institutions, and religious institutions are part of that. And I think that's why we see a lot of denominations shrinking, because people are leaving an institutional expression of religion while they still feel religious or spiritual.
I talked to, in preparation for this, two very devout Episcopalians. One of them a Sewanee alumnus like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them came back, and I said, give me some issues to ask the bishop about, things that are hard-headed. And both of them came back to this issue of membership.
Uh-huh.
And while I was quoted at a dinner table, somebody getting on the little iPad and digging numbers away that highlighted the situation in the Episcopal Church, drops in attendance at service, drops in confirmation, reductions in the number of baptized members. It's clear that is not limited to the Episcopal Church, is it?
That's right. It used to be happening primarily to the mainstream of religious denominations, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians. It's a little hard to judge Roman Catholics because they consider, if you were born into a Roman Catholic family, then you're a practicing Roman Catholic. That actually may not be true, so the numbers there are hard to judge. But it used to be, and until reasonably recently, that the evangelical churches, the sort of the freestanding churches and the more fundamentalist churches and so on, were not losing members, and that has changed. And I just was reading, I think 2 weeks ago, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is, of course, is the largest Protestant denomination in America, is shrinking in numbers of congregations, numbers of people, and so on. And they are, this is new for them, and they are a little bit in a panic about it. Many of the mega churches are losing members as well, and in particular, they are hemorrhaging young people. And the number one reason these young people give for leaving is the critical, judgmental stance these places take around gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender people. And unlike other generations before them, today's kids have friends who are already out as gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. And they know that what's being said about those kinds of people is simply not true because they know them. And so I sort of compare it to back in the 60s, in the days of the civil rights movement. There was a big move for white people to stop joining country clubs that wouldn't take blacks or Jews. And so these young people don't want to belong to an institution that would judge their friends in this way. So I think now we can fairly safely say it's across the board. And I would go back to my first statement, which is I think it's this disillusionment with institutions. And certainly the child abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church has contributed to that, right? And has contributed to this distrust of institutions.
Yeah, and let's just pick one tough number.
Sure.
And that is that when you speak about this dissatisfaction about organized religion's statements about gay and transgender folks, that isn't young people being angry about treatment of themselves.
That's correct.
It's treatment of their others to whom they are attached and feel close.
That's exactly right. So this is not self-serving on their part. They are outraged on behalf of these people, these friends that they have, that they know and love, and they know that what they're being told about them is simply not true.
Right. I have a church background, but I think I've never heard such a statement from the pulpit.
Yeah.
And I've been perhaps that's simply the path I've chosen, not because of that. Just,
right.
Just the people that I wanted to have as my pastor.
Exactly.
Who are a bit more open.
It's amazing to me that in 2019, knowing what we know, and it was one thing 30 years ago. I came out 34 years ago, something like that. Most people in America would have told you they didn't know someone gay. But now, I mean, really, how many people don't know that somebody in their family, some neighbor, some coworker, almost everyone now can say, I actually know someone who's gay. And that changes everything.
I have to laugh at that. And the crew here is of an age, and having grown up in Western New York, I've gotten to know them very well. And I remember after we had somebody whom we've discussed appeared on camera and said he was gay, I was concerned, is this going to be trouble in Mayville? And the crew came back and said, not at all, because that's the way it is.
That's exactly right. The most astounding statistic around that and religion is that the Public Research Religion Institute, I think it is PRRI, does extremely fine polling. And they have discovered that every segment of religion, not just every segment of Christianity, but every segment of every religion is a majority in favor of gay marriage and pro-gay policies. Now, the hierarchy may not be, the leadership, whether that be the Roman Catholic hierarchy and the Vatican and so on, or it may be the pastor in an evangelical church who is preaching sort of an anti-gay message every Sunday. But if you ask the people in the pews, at least a majority of them are positive about it. And it's just simply because they now know one or usually more people who are LGBT.
And the academic literature goes back to the 1950s and 60s when the discussion was made about prejudice toward racial people. There's I'm talking as a psychology professor, robust body of research that attempted to predict who would listen to a black defendant in a criminal trial, simply hear the case through. And they found the single best predictor was to ask a question on the stand to a white defendant in a white neighborhood, perhaps the rural South. In the past month, have you had lunch with a black person? And if the answer comes back, yes, very good predictor, that person would be open to hear, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be automatically approving.
Of course.
But open to hear the case, the facts laid out in full.
That's right.
And so indeed, that matter of a friendship circle, predicting one's attitudes, well established.
And I mean, it's true of almost everything, right? If we have an experience of something, then our stereotypes about that thing can't survive because the reality, the real people, are much more diverse and complex and so on. But if you don't know anyone in that particular category, then you can believe all the stereotypes you've ever been taught, no matter how inaccurate they are.
Indeed, indeed. So let's talk a little further about this issue of religion today in the United States. Attendance at church membership is down. If you had a free hand, what might you do to encourage attendance?
So here's my read on where we are, and it comes out of my read on what enlivens young people. This think tank that I worked for in Washington, D.C., between when I was the Bishop of New Hampshire and coming here to Chautauqua, it was a very secular place. And it was filled with these 20-somethings who, almost all of whom had rejected institutional religion, but still had these spiritual questions, right? The one thing that would draw them in would be social justice work. If a congregation, actually practiced what they preached on Sunday through the week, then they were interested. If they could get their hands dirty, if they could help prepare meals at a homeless shelter, or if they could, just fill in the blank, but do something with their bodies, with their minds, and actually get involved in making the world a better place. Not just standing back and telling the world to get better, but actually doing something about it. That, I think, is the key, because, again, going back to the distrust of institutions, I think hypocrisy. Hypocrisy's always been unpopular with young people, right? We all have looked to the older generation and decried the hypocrisy. But we're all guilty of it.
Right.
The question is, to what degree? And I think when they see a community of people together working to make the world a more just place, that's something they can get behind. And then once they're in that community of people doing that work, they're apt to decide they're going to go to church where those people go to church, just to see what it's like. Give it a second try. And what I keep saying to young people is, maybe the church you left isn't the church that's there now.
That's a good point.
You ought to check back in, because they actually might have learned something in the last 10 years or 20 years, right? Mm-hmm. And you owe it to yourself just to check it out.
Mm-hmm. Church where I hold membership says that our big service component is preschool, and they look at it, and it, by reputation, is the best preschool in town within the neighborhood, and only a quarter of the or fewer of the families that send their kids to church start out going to that church. Most of them are, as a preacher might say, unchurched.
Right.
And by the end of the preschool, guess what happens to most of the families?
Wow.
They want a church experience.
That's right.
And so the position is that if they have to cut money someplace, and by the performance of the recent capital campaign, which was 3 years and filled in 3 months.
Wow.
That
speaks louder than words, doesn't it?
That's right. That clear, as a mainstream Protestant church, that clearly says something about them.
Absolutely.
And we can talk about little points, but the big issues I think are there with service to others.
That's right. And I think in some ways, that's always been a draw, but it used to be that you just ought to go to church, and that was enough.
Right.
And that just doesn't cut it anymore. And people get along just fine, in their opinion, without it. And so I think you have to be very much more committed to and conscious of what you're doing to make the world a better place.
We also found that the secular world changes in one of the respects that the church had to adjust is in scheduling. And years ago, it used to be that there would not be sports leagues on Sunday mornings.
Right.
And then when there were sports leagues on Sunday mornings, what do we do to lose these families? It was time to begin a Saturday night service, and that's full of a bunch of teenage kids in blue jeans. Come
right.
and do what's appropriate for you.
Right, and if you're a kid and you're out till 1 in the morning on Saturday night, a 9 o'clock service is not your cup of tea.
That's right.
But a 6 o'clock evening service with lots of candles and a lovely atmosphere and other people your age, that could draw you in.
I've seen it happen.
Yeah.
I think that was an appropriate move. Let's talk a little bigger in the perspective of the United States, if we can, today. And we understand that maltreatment of others is one of those folks that drives off young folks. Mm-hmm. What other sorts of things could be done to encourage church participation? I'm showing myself here. Church participation and religious commitment.
I think people are drawn to good role models, and by that I mean people who who seem to take their faith quite seriously in terms of letting it govern their own behavior. You know, one of the things that made Jesus so angry was the arrogance of those who were wealthier, who were better looking, better educated, better everything, right? And they would look down on those less fortunate and usually condemn them morally as well as treat them like dirt. It always made Jesus mad. And so if any community, but especially a church, is supposed to be doing this in God's name, is treating someone that way, or a group of people that way, that's going to drive people away. And conversely, an individual or a community who seems actually to believe that every single human being is a child of God and should be treated that way, that draws people. That's the honey, not the vinegar, right? That draws people, and so I think that's in some ways always been true. But we had other things supporting attendance at churches in those days. You mentioned, nothing else is going on Sunday, right? That helped.
Yeah.
We don't have those supports anymore, and so what we are left with is this a community where the values espoused by responsible Christians, is really being lived out? Or is it something we talk about here, and honestly, it has no effect whatsoever on my behavior this week?
So it's the values that are present. Your perspective is that's the most important reason.
I think so. I think that's really true. And because we have so many bad models, right, in our culture, I just think of all the scandals, think of all the I think that was one of the reasons that President Obama was so popular with young people, was that, there was, we went for 8 years without a major White House scandal. That was a remarkable time. There's no Democrat or Republican before him that I can recall, or certainly in my lifetime, that didn't have a scandal or 12,
Right.
So I think people are looking for the real deal, right? Someone who is authentically loving their neighbor.
Right. I have one more question that I want to ask, and
Sure.
then I'm going to give you a moment to sort of finish up with things. And this is a question that I've asked. We had 3 people last year on our program, our 12, who would be Reverend Doctors. And I asked each one of them, and I want to hear your take.
Okay.
The young Chautauquan came to you and said, "Bishop, I'm thinking of going into a career of church work." What would you tell that person?
Usually, a person like that would tell me that they wanted to be an ordained person. And my first question to them is, what is it that you want to do, and do you have to be ordained to do it? I think we quickly move into the ordination focus before we actually find out what a person wants to do. What are they good at? What actually is their passion? And there are some passions that ordination would just kill, right? Ordination is not for everyone, and I think the greatest movement in the last half century in terms of religion is the role of lay people. We have gotten away from this notion that when you say someone's a minister, you mean someone ordained, right? Because every person in the pew should be a minister as well. And so I think to this young person, I would say, you may not need to be ordained, or in fact, you may be called. I would also say, has anyone said to you, you ought to think about being a minister? Because I think God actually works indirectly in that way. We don't get a voice out of heaven, or at least most of us don't, telling us what we should do and not. But but we get messages, right, from other people, especially people who know us deeply, and I think we should listen to that. I would also say, don't stay in a church that isn't doing what a church should do, which is facilitate your relationship with God. If you're not getting that where you're going to church, go to another church. There are churches out there who will help you with that. And I think that is the very first thing that a church should do. Because if they assist you in your connection with God, then you're going to start being a better person.
Right.
That's the result of that, or at least that's my faith.
Right. Right. I think that's some critical points. And occasionally some Chautauqua young people will.
Yes, indeed.
Will share.
Do you know that there's a young man who is part of our what we call the Woods crew? I think their boss might have been Mr. Woods at some point.
And I know we have somebody who's in Colgate, Rochester, who headed up the Woods crew.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Well, so one of them who helps us at the Hall of Philosophy at the 2 o'clock religion lecture every afternoon is very active, is in seminary, and is serving in Jamestown as a substitute pastor for someone who has to be away for some reason. And I mean, he and I talk every day, and it's people like him who's going to turn the church around.
We've got to compare notes. I think we may. I hope we're not talking about the same person.
Well, I don't know.
Because we may have two good ones in the Woods crew.
Wouldn't that be nice?
We're talking about different folks. I always like to give our guests, particularly someone like yourself, who's had some very profound life experiences and faith experiences, share the last minute and a half. What point do we need to cover?
Sure. This may or may not be what you're looking for. I think that the world right now needs a healthy dose of humility. I think this polarization that we are experiencing, at its core, is arrogance. My belief is way better than your belief, or you don't know what you're talking about, or your experience is not valid. Mine is, and so I don't need to bother with you. I think the world would be a lot better place saying, if we're saying to ourselves, so my experience has taught me a lot, but gosh, there's a lot I don't know. And at the end of the day, most every person I meet, I don't know all that well. And if we could spend a bit more time listening, and trusting that there is something of worth in every child of God, and try to discover what that is, it would change a lot of things. I think ultimately, it would change the world, because a nation could begin to think that way.
Indeed.
Like, we don't have a corner on the truth. We don't have a corner on the right way to act in the world, and a little humility would go a long way. And I think at the end of the day, it's the kind of life that Jesus led, and that in and of itself changed the world.
Indeed, that's fantastic. We're out of time, and this has been great fun.
Thank you
Do
so
come
much.
back.
It's just been great to be with you. Thank you.